In this lesson, I'm going to demonstrate how to use the input function in Python. By input function, we simply mean that the user will be prompted to enter some value or piece of information. So when we're writing code or creating a program, there may be instances where we would like user input, and that's exactly where the input function. So by simple definition, the input and output functions in Python exist so that programmers can speak to users through the code instead of having to manually enter in data by themselves. The real goal is to automate various processes by allowing maximizing user input. And this way, the programmer or the developer doesn't really have to enter a lot of extra code, because most times the user can be prompted to enter the information. And this is pretty common. For instance, you're browsing on the internet and you go to certain websites and you're prompted to enter your username, password, or if you enter an incorrect username, you are displayed with a message, and so on. So wherever the user input is required, the input function in Python is a very powerful function, and we'll take a look at what that does for us when we try to code. Why do we use input function? If we want to ask the user a simple question like, how old are you? Or what is your name? We're asking the user for some input. What is your age? What's your favorite color? And so on. We can pose a question, give a prompt, and wait for the user to enter in the answer. Python has a built-in function called input that does exactly this. Next, let's take a look at how the input function works. So in this particular example, using the shell prompt, you simply type input and then parentheses, quotations, enter your name. So the function is input, and you simply, within the parentheses, prompt the user to do something. So for example, let me demonstrate this. So if I were to say input, and I'm going to say, how old are you? And then I'm going to put a question mark here and then close my parentheses. Okay, as soon as I hit enter, Python asks for input. How old are you? And I can enter the value 22, of course not my real age, and Python displays the output. Now so far the output is displayed as a string. Okay, and I'll get to that in a subsequent slide, how to convert from string to numbers and how to make sure that our lines of code is correct. But just a basic idea of the input syntax is the input function and then of course our parentheses, and you prompt the user. So by using the input statement along with a string containing the question you'd like to ask the user, you can get a response you're looking for. Since the input is string, in other words text, the output will also be string, even though you're asking a question that entails numbers or integers, and integers and strings do not match, or numbers and text do not match. You cannot really add text to a number. Since your input was string, the output will also be string. But if I were to say something like input and then enter your name, if I hit enter, it prompts me for enter my name, and I can say it's John. And this time it's printed as a text string, which is fine. And of course I need to spell correctly, like enter your name. Let's try again so we make sure we're on the right track. And I'm going to say enter your name, close my parentheses, and this time I have the correct output, which is John. So in this instance, the input was string and the output is also string or text. And we'll get back to the concept of converting numbers and how do we handle this issue in Python. Let's take a look at a couple of other examples, and let me in fact open up our Python editor here. So I'm going to click on File, New, and let's resize so you can see. So let's create a small program, all right, where we're asking user to enter some data. Let's say you're having and interview, right? So you're working for a company and you like to interview certain candidates, okay, or that scenario. So let's see if we can create a few lines of code that requires user input. So I'm going to start off with my comment here first. It's always a good idea. So enter first name of the applicant who's there to interview. Variable here, call applicant equals input. I'm going to prompt the applicant to enter the applicant's name. Enter the applicant's name. And the next variable is the interviewer, right? The person who's going to interview this guy. And I'm going to prompt one more time, give an input. And I'm going to say enter the interviewer's name. Okay, close my parentheses. So I have two variables here that I've specified. Next, I'm going to say time, and I'm going to also use the input one more time for time, and then say enter the appointment time. Okay, great. So 3 inputs that Python is going to prompt for. First, enter the applicant's name. Second, enter the interviewer's name. And third, enter the appointment time. And finally, I'm going to say print all of these variables, right? Print interviewer, like who interviewed this guy. And of course, I need to make sure my spellings match or my variable names are correct. Interview. Okay. And then the applicant, of course, which is the variable again, applicant. And I'm going to say at, which is my string, and then my last variable at time. Great. And of course, I can always copy my comments and make sure my code follows a consistent convention. So enter interviewer name, or I can simply say who's interviewing. Okay. And of course, I can run the comment for time and then finally print. So let's say we have this small input program. I'm going to run it by clicking on the run option. Click on run module. Of course, the source must be saved. Click OK. I'm going to go to my Python's folder, which is under data files, Python. I'm going to call it input 1. Click save. And when Python runs it, it asks me for the applicant's name. So I'm going to say it's John. Enter the interviewer's name. So I'm going to say Emily. And the appointment time. So I can say something like 10:30 a.m. And Emily will interview John at 10:30 a.m. Okay. Now, of course, Emily will, it's W-I-L-L, but I have a single L, and that's because within my string, I need to make sure my code is correct. And the spellings are correct also. So let's correct it, run one more time, and this time we're good to go. And it's John, Emily, and then the time 10:30 a.m. There we go. So a good example of using the input command, and you can prompt every single time for user input. A very powerful way of creating code. Now, before we actually convert text to number, I'm going to show you that, but I'm going to run through a couple more examples. For instance, let me do another example. So I'm going to open up my editor here one more time. And let's click on new file, close the previous file. Here we go. All right, great. So here I'm going to use another example, similar concept, but different. The more examples we work with, the easier it becomes. All right, great. So I'm going to use xstring, for example, as a variable name. And here I'm going to ask for input. And I'm going to ask the user enter a number. Okay, great. And of course, make sure I have the correct spaces. And next, I'm going to declare another variable here. I'm going to say x equals integer. And I'm going to say x string. Now, this is where I'm in fact telling Python that I'm interested in converting this X string, which in fact is a string. So enter number is a string, but I need to convert it into an actual number format. So that's why we say, or we declare a variable called X, and the function is int, or integer, right? So integer X string, close my parentheses, and here are my two variables. Same thing, I'm going to go with Y string equals input, and this time I'm going to say enter a second number. And finally our variable Y equals, I'm going to convert integer Y string as well. String, close my parentheses, and finally do a print function. And here I'm going to add both of these. So I'm going to say, for example, the sum of my variable X and Y, and then I'm going to say is, and I'm going to add those two variables together, X plus Y. And of course, I need my parentheses for my string values. So the sum of X and Y. And Python again is nice about this, because if you don't have the syntax correct, it's not going to color code correctly. Okay, so you can take a look at before you even run the module, you can always make sure that your syntax is correct. And this looks correct. Why? Because we have the string in green color, we have our variables in black, and we're adding variables which is also in black, and our print function is in purple. So this now makes sense and looks consistent as well. So let's run this module. Click on run module, save it first, and I'm going to call it number. And the first instruction is enter a number. So I'm going to say it's 5, hit the enter key, enter a second number, and it's 8, hit the enter key. And Python displays the sum of 5 and 8 is 13. And that's exactly what I wanted Python to do. Okay, all right, great. Next, needing to convert string input to numbers is a common situation. So you'll come across this almost all the time when you're writing code in Python. You need to convert strings to text, numbers, and so on. So let's do another example here. So bring up the editor one more time. Open up a new one. And let's close this. Okay, great. So here I have variables, simple variables like a equals 10 and b equals 99. And then I have my variable c, which is simply doing a simple addition of variables a and b. Okay, and I do print c. Simple, right? So let's see what happens. I want to show you something interesting here. So I'm going to click on run module, save it. I want to call it number 1 here. All right, great. So what Python does, it prints 1099, right? 1099. And I'm going to show you the code also. Here it is. So what I'm doing here is I'm declaring a variable a equals 10, which is string. So it's not a number. B is 99, which is also a string and is not a number. When I add both of these strings together and see the output is 1099, which is not a number. So in Python, you may see 1099 and intuitively you think of this as, well, this looks like 1099 or 1099. But in fact, it's a string. Let me clarify. Let me demonstrate how do we find out what's going on here. Let's convert the value of c into an integer. So instead of 1099 as a string, I'm going to go ahead and make our c as an integer, or convert this variable c simply using the int for conversion, and I'm going to say c. Okay, This time, when I rerun the module, source must be saved, click OK. My output is the same. It's still 1099. So there's no difference between the previous output and the current output. However, in this case, the 1099 is in fact a number. It's not text anymore. Well, how do I double check? How do I make sure that this is the number? And how do I know whether the previous 1099 was not a number? All right, well, let's double check. Let's run some few lines of code again, or add some new lines. So, or right after print. Okay, let's do another one. Let's do a D here, variable. So let's say the value of D is 7. So what happens when I add variable D, which has an integer value of 7, to my C? If C is an integer, then my value will be added, or it will be correct answer, because numbers add numbers. I'm not adding numbers in text anymore because C is now an integer, and I'm just double checking or confirming whether C is an integer or not. And if C is an integer, then my addition will be correct. So I'm going to say print D plus C. Perfect. Let's run it. Click on run module, click OK, and here we go. So it's 1106. In other words, Python correctly added 1099 plus 7, and the result is 1106. So this means that C is now a number. Okay, how do I know the previous 1099 was a string? And I can confirm that also by adding D to a string. So let me remove or delete the conversion where I'm converting string to a number. So I'm going to delete this line, for instance, the integer. So here now I have a variable called A, which is value of 10, which is a string, B 99 string, and I'm simply adding the two strings together. I'm printing the output. And now I have a new variable called D equals 7, which is a number. And I'm simply adding D plus C. Let's run this and see what happens. Click OK. And notice this time we get a type error, because Python is looking for the operand. So it says unsupported operand types for plus, integer, and string. In other words, integers and strings cannot be added. So therefore, wherever there's a string, it needs to be converted into an integer before you can do the addition, subtraction, multiplication, or any operator that you wish to use. So the input function is pretty powerful, and I demonstrated how to work with input function both in string format as well as in numbers, and also how to convert your string to numbers, and also to make sure our code is correct and Python recognizes the input correctly. So I hope this helps. Practice, and let's move to our next lesson.